Hi everyone, let's continue with Paul's letter to the churches. Oh my word, now I've got a hair that's like in my face and I can't get it off. It's off. The joys of having long hair, it falls out. Alright, let's start with Paul's letters to the churches, encouragement, correction, and direction. From the darkness of prison, the Apostle Paul wrote incredible words of encouragement to the Philippian church. The deep connection of trust and love between Paul and the Philippians is evident in his letters. Even though he was in prison, Paul wrote that his predicament had helped to spread the good news, and that the Philippians should rejoice with him. That's in Philippians 1 verse 22 and 4 verse 4. Let's read it today. So let's go to Philippians. At least we now know that it is in the New Testament because we're doing the New Testament. So let's see. Philippians 1 verse 12. Okay, so for Philippians 1 verse 12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. That's 12. And then Philippians 4 verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I will say, rejoice. Paul's letter to the Philippians is a high watermark of encouragement, but his letters to other churches included rebuke and correction. Writing letters had not been a typical method of religious instruction among the Jewish people, but it became a preferred form of communication to disseminate information relatively quickly among a growing body of people spread over a large geographic area. The Apostle Paul is responsible for writing 13 of the 27 books in the New Testament. All his works are letters written to churches or individuals between AD 50 and 70. We'll cover Paul's letters written to churches in the chapter and those written to individuals in the next two chapters. So, letters to the churches is Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and then 1 and 2 Thessalonians. Letters to individuals is 1 and 2 Timothy, Philemon, and Titus. The Apostle Paul's given name was Saul. He was born in the city of Tarsus in what is modern-day Turkey. His parents were Pharisees and raised him as a religious Jewish nationalist. As a young man, Saul learned under the great Rabbi Gamaliel and became a religious extremist, highly educated in the Jewish scriptures. Saul spent his early career persecuting Christians to the point that he sought to destroy the church by imprisoning both Christian men and women. That's verse 3. Let's read it. Acts 8 verse 3. Okay. But Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. The pivotal moment in Saul's life occurred on the Damascus Road when Jesus spoke to him through a bright light. Temporarily blinded, Saul was led to a Christian named Ananias, who helped him realize the truth of Christ. The prosecutor of the early church would soon become a missionary for the expansion of God's kingdom. His name was changed to Paul, but more importantly, his zealousness was now for Christ alone. Before embarking on his missionary journey, Paul spent 3 years in Arabia preparing. If you guys do hear Any kiddies laughing in the background? My kids has got friends, so they're a bit loud this morning. Okay, his combination of Roman citizenship, Greek education, and Hebrew religion helped equip him for the task of expanding the early church. Over the course of 3 missionary journeys and his final journey to Rome, Paul planted churches, wrote letters, and encouraged young churches to hold the church truth and share the good news about Jesus. Even as he experienced persecution and imprisonment, Paul never lost sight of God's mission to reach not only Jewish people but also Gentiles. As you read Paul's letters, note the differences in subject matter and tone. The Philippian church was in great shape, so Paul wrote to encourage them. The Corinthian church had many problems, and Paul wrote to correct them. The Galatian church was suffering doctrinal attacks from a legalistic religious sect of Judaism, while the Colossian church was influenced by the philosophy of the Gnosticism. Every letter was written to address a specific circumstance. That means his letters are occasional in nature, written in response to a problem or situation within the church. Paul wrote to a particular people in a particular place and time. To understand Paul's teachings, it is wise to learn as much as possible about the context within which the letter was written. The letter should also be read in their entirety to avoid taking individual passages out of context. We begin with a letter that helped develop the doctrine of the church. Romans is the longest letter and arguably the deepest theologically. Okay. Romans, developing doctrine and applying doctrine. The placement of Romans after Acts is no accident. Luke wrote Acts to provide a historical narrative about the growth of the early church. And Paul wrote Romans circa AD 56 to 58 to help develop the doctrine of the church. With these 2 books, we begin to understand how the church expanded outward on a mission as it deepened roots theologically. The first chapter of Romans gives a dismal picture of the human condition. The downward spiral of sin leads everyone to death. But there is also good news. Anyone can be made righteous through the power of Christ's salvation. The structure of Romans falls in 2 parts. Theology and doctrine, that's Romans 1 through to 8, and then life application, Romans 9 through to 16. In Romans 1 to 8, Paul masterfully reveals the proper theology and doctrine of the church. In Romans 9 through to 16, he gives the life application for these doctrines. The first half of the book develops what the church believes, and the second half of the book details how we should live what we believe. The gospel of salvation is at the center of Romans. In the first 4 chapters, Paul explains why it's necessary for God to show his righteousness and why people can experience his righteousness only by faith alone. In Romans 5 through to 8, Paul discusses the significance of justification. That sin no longer has a hold on us, and the law no longer controls us. It is through the Holy Spirit that the Christian enjoys the assurance of eternal victory. In Romans 9 through to 11, Paul focuses on Israel. He explains that not all Hebrew people will accept God's salvation, but through Israel, God brought salvation to anyone who accepts Christ. In Romans 12 through to 16, Paul examines the more practical question of what it looks like to live as grace-filled, gospel-focused people. Common throughout the book is the linguistic device called a diatribe, in which a teacher pursued students using a back and forth dialogue with theoretical questions and answer. The ancient form of argumentation was popular at the time and is prominent in Romans 6 through to 7. Okay, so I'm going to go through the table again. So that's passage, theoretical question, and then the answer. Romans 6, verse 1 to 2. Well then, should we keep on sinning so that God can show us more and more of His wonderful grace? The answer is, of course not. Since we have died to sin, how can we continue to live in it? Romans 6, verse 15 through to 16. Well then, since God's grace has set us free from the law, does that mean we can go out sinning? Of course not. Don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? Romans 7, verse 7. Well then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. Romans 7, verse 13. But how can that be? Did the law which is good cause my death? Of course not. Sin used what was good to bring about my condemnation to death. So we can see how terrible sin really is. Okay. Some of the most prominent Christian leaders in history accepted Christ as a result of reading Romans. 16th century church reformer Martin Luther studied Romans and called it the very purest gospel and the chief of the part of the New Testament. In Romans, Paul details how we are sinful by nature and how Christ saves us. Several key doctrines of faith are rooted in this letter. Regeneration, God's work to give us a new spiritual life. Conversion, our willing response to the good news of Jesus. Justification, God declares us righteous, having right legal standing before God. Adoption, an act of God to bring us into His family. Sanctification, the progressive work of the Holy Spirit in our lives to make us more like Christ. Romans is a rich book filled with theology and life application. At times the letter is not an easy read, but is supremely edifying. Okay. Let's see. Maybe I can read one more because time's almost up. No, this is all we have time for today. I will continue with 1 and 2 Corinthians, correcting error in the church, tomorrow. You guys should have a very good day and a one blessed day as well. I'm going to have a busy one, having friends over for the kiddos. All right, so you guys must enjoy and I'll speak to you soon.